Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Hare Krishna, today we are reading Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 12, Creation of the Kumaras and Others. Text 33. Saitam Grindata Putran. Saitam Grindata Putran. Purodrishtva Prajapatin. Purodrishtva Prajapatin. Prajapati Patistanvam. Prajapati Patistanvam. Tatyaja Viritastata. Tatyaja Viritastata. Tam Dishoja Grihogoram. Tam Dishoja Grihogoram. Niharam Yadvidostamaha. Niharam Yadvidostamaha. Saitam Grindata Putran. Prodrishtva Prajapatin. Prajapati Patistanvam. Tyatyaja Vriditastada. Tam Dishoja Grihogoram. Niharam Yadvidostamaha. Saitam Grindata Putran. Prodrishva Prajapatin. Prajapati Patistanvam. Yaja Vriditastada. Tam Dishoja Grihogoram. Yadvidostamaha. Saitam Grindata Putran. Prodrishtva Prajapatin. Prajapati Patistanvam. Tatyaja Vriditastada. Tam Dishoja Grihogoram. Yaram Yadvidostamaha. Saitam Grindata Putran. Prodrishtva Prajapatin. Prajapati Patistanvam. Tatyavidastada. Tam Dishoja Grihogoram. Niharam Yadvidostamaha. Notes? Word to word. Saha. He, Brahma. Itam. Thus. Grinataha. Speaking. Putran. Sons. Puraha. Before. Drishtva. Seeing. Prajapatin. All the progenitors of living entities. Prajapati Patihi. The father of all of them. Brahma. Tanvam. Body. Tatyaja. Quit. Vriditaha. Ashamed. Tada. At that time. Tam. That body. Dijaha. All directions. Chagrihuhu. Accepted. Goram. Blamable. Niharam. Fog. Yat. Which. Viduhu. They know as. Tamaha. Darkness. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace of Bhaktivedanta Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada, Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. The father of all Prajapatis, Brahma, thus seeing all his Prajapati sons speaking in that way, became very much ashamed and at once gave up the body he had accepted. Later that body appeared in all directions as a dangerous fog in darkness. Purport. The best way to compensate for one's sinful acts is to give up one's body at once, and Brahma, the leader of the living entities, showed this by his personal example. Brahma has a fabulous duration of life, but he was obliged to give up his body due to his grievous sin, even though he had merely contemplated in his mind, without having actually done it. This is a lesson for the living entities, showing how sinful an act it is to indulge in unrestricted sex life. Even to think of abominable sex life is sinful, and to compensate for such sinful acts, one has to give up his body. In other words, one's duration of life, blessings, opulence, etc., are decreased by sinful acts, and the most dangerous type of sinful act is unrestricted sex. Ignorance is the cause of sinful life, or sinful life is the cause of gross ignorance. The feature of ignorance is darkness or fog. Darkness or fog still covers the whole universe, and the sun is the only counteracting principle. One who takes shelter of the Lord, the perpetual light, has no fear of being annihilated in the darkness of fog or ignorance. Om Kyanam Timirandasya Grananjana Shalakya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasma Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manopishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Svayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadate Svabadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Uttapadakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamshcha Shri Rupam Sagrachatam Sahaganarakunatan Vitam Tam Sachivam Sadvetam Savadutam Parishana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhan Vitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostate Tapta Kanchana Gorange Radhe Vrindavaneshvare Vrishabhana Sutedevi Pranamame Hare Priya Mancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhyuba Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhya Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadara Srivasari Gaura Bhakta Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, welcome this morning. Thank you for coming. So we are continuing in, quite unique section in Srimad Bhagavatam, where we not only, because generally, obviously, we always hear either about the dangers of material life, of how we are trapped by the illusory energy, or about the greatness and sweetness of Krishna and his dealings with his devotees. But here, we not only hear about the dangers of material life, but we see from our practical example of our own head of our parampara, of the first living being in this universe, Lord Brahma himself, how he got bewildered. Obviously, as Prabhupada was in the last few purports, pointing out the greatness of Lord Brahma, so to make it clear to us not to in any way have an offensive mentality when we hear this pastime. So not to, obviously we could never think of looking down upon Lord Brahma, or how did he do such a thing. It's simply to teach us the lesson. Can you increase the volume a little bit? And and so today Prabhupada comes back again more to the lesson itself, after having described how great Lord... Not so much. Hare Krishna. Yeah. Thank you. So, how dangerous it is, this illusory energy, especially here in the form of sex desire. And because we know the pastime, just to quickly, for those who haven't followed recently, so what happened is that when in the course of we are hearing about the chapters titled Creation of Kaumaras and others, so in other words, of Brahma's, Lord Brahma's service of secondary creation, still a bit low, sorry, it's echoing. And during the course of that, then at one point he created one of his daughters called Vak, who is the personification of speech. And he got attracted to her. And that's at that point then, but as Prabhupada points out in the purport today, he didn't do anything externally, just in his mind he got attracted. But his sons were all elevated souls. They understood immediately what's happening, and they came before their father, and as Prabhupada pointed out, they did point out his mistake, but they did it very respectfully. And so they were speaking several verses, actually today's verses. Yeah, so that finished yesterday, yeah. So yesterday they concluded, they're addressing Lord Brahma, and after having pointed out his mistake, then they concluded in yesterday's verse of, because Prabhupada pointed out that actually Brahma was still not persuaded from his desire. So then they saw, the last resort now is simply that on behalf of Lord Brahma they offered prayers to the Supreme Lord. So they were appealing to the Lord to please help Lord Brahma and to bring him back to his good sense. And so in today's verse, the description continues by Maitreya Rishi of the situation and what Brahma did upon that. So we heard in today's verse, we hear how he actually at that point then he realized his mistake and he felt very much ashamed, so much so that he gave up his body. It's described here, and Prabhupada points out how amazing it is that Lord Brahma, he has this extremely long duration of life. You know, this Dvipadada being 311 trillion and 40 billion of our years, and still he had to give up his body. But obviously it doesn't mean that his life ended. He can change his body as he likes. and Rajana Krishna Prabhu a few days ago, he had described that actually, so by giving up this body, I think perhaps we'll hear it later here, or otherwise in another part of Bhagavatam, that then he was able to, having created Vak from that previous body, meant then this material relation of father and child, daughter, disappeared as soon as he took up a new body, and in that way then he was able to marry her, and she is then no other than his wife, Mother Saraswati. And so, but coming back to the first point that Prabhupada is talking here in the purport about how great a sinful act actually illicit sex is. And I was sometimes thinking on that, like, it seems, even to us, what to speak if we would try to explain to new people, it seems not so intuitive that is such a great sin. We would think, well, murder or molesting someone else or whatever kind of other violence or great sinful acts you could think of, that sins, but just illicit sex, like, seems it doesn't really affect anyone much. But Prabhupada explains in other parts that why it is so, and it is because we know the origin of all sins. The original sin is to be, rather than knowing ourselves as the eternal loving servitor of Krishna, that we somehow or other want to imitate him. In other words, we let envy creep in. We are envious of his being Purushottama, being the supreme enjoyer. And that highest, most intense expression of that envy in the material world is sex. Because that's, as Prabhu, Ivaresvara Prabhu was yesterday nicely explaining how it is the most degraded and at the same time the most, the highest pleasure you get actually, material pleasure, and that's why it's the most binding and most implicating. And that's why Prabhupada is explaining here, it is actually the greatest sin. And for example, even so, coming back to this, why? Because of this envy, because it's full expression of our envy of Krishna. And Krishna, for example, in Bhagavad Gita himself explains how all living entities get born into this material world being in illusion. And why is that? That arises from icha dvesha, from desire and hate or envy. So we desire to enjoy separately from him, and we are envious of him being the enjoyer. So it's in 7th chapter, I don't remember the verse number, but some icha dvesha samutena dvandva mohana bharata sarva bhutani samoham saragyanti parantapa. And yeah, so it arises from this desire and hate, the dualities of which put us into this illusion, where we identify with the body and with all temporary things related to the body, and thus completely forget who we actually are and what real happiness is. And also obviously Krishna speaks quite a bit on this topic of lust in Bhagavad Gita. In end of 2nd chapter, he describes the fall down process from dhyayato vishayam pumsa, how from contemplating on the sense objects and then arises lust, attachment, and anger and so forth, which from eventually we lose our memory, our intelligence, and so forth. But also especially in the 3rd chapter, where Arjuna at one point is asking Krishna, what is it by which one is impelled to act in ways that we actually don't intend to generally, that we are inclined to do, but in sinful ways, in things that we regret later. And so what is that force apparently against our will? And obviously it's our misuse of our free will, that we get into the material nature and thus we have those lower desires deep inside us. So in that sense, it's obviously not against our will, but like I mentioned last time, as Soma points out to the Prachetas, that just as anger, for example, seems to just appear spontaneously like falling from the sky. And anger obviously comes from frustration of trying to fulfill our lust or our material desires. So yeah, and in the same way, lust appears to just come up without our actively desiring it. And so, yeah, Krishna explains then in those famous verses, that's from 3:37. Kamesha krodesha rachakona samutpavaha mahashano mahapapma vidyanam ihavayarinam. That it is lust only, kamaesha krodesha, which then degrades, if not fulfilled, into anger, into mode of ignorance, from mode of passion. And if which arises from the mode of passion, Rashaguna Samutpavaha, Mahashano Mahapapma. It is the great, all-devouring, sinful enemy of this world. Vidyanam Ihavayarinam. And then and again, why it is like that, we just discussed, because it gives us the best facility for full forgetfulness of Krishna and envying him, expressing our envy. And so then in the next verse, he gives an analogy of how this lust covers the living entity, and he gives 3 degrees of this lust, which I'll explain after. So it's Dumena vriyate vanya yata drasho malena cha yatolbina vrita garapas tatadinedam avritam. And interesting also is that Krishna in all those verses he uses the word avritam for covering. And actually even just vrita means covering, like we see in 6th canto, for example, Vritasura, who was Chitraketu Maharaj in his previous life, a great devotee, but then by the Lord's will he got cursed by Mother Parvati to take the body of a demon, and of a very, very large body, because that's where his name comes from. It's described Vritasura, he covered the whole sky, like all the way up to heavenly planets or something, at least up into the sky. So that's Vrita, but Krishna uses Avritam, which means emphasizes or makes it stronger, the meaning. So really covered we get by this lust. And so the first example he gives is Dumen avriyate vanir. Just as fire gets covered by smoke. And that is compared to the human form of life, where the covering is least strong as compared to lower forms of life, where we have, therefore, in this form of life, you have the best opportunities to revive our original Krishna consciousness. And then Yadtadarsho Malenacha, just as a mirror is covered by dust. And that is a bit stronger of a covering, obviously, because smoke you can very easily fan away and see the fire very nicely. Whereas dust on the mirror, you actually have to wipe it. So that's a bit stronger, that's compared to animal life. And then even lower is an even stronger covering is then the embryo in the womb, Tolbinavrito Gadapas, so the embryo being covered by the womb. There's no, he's completely isolated actually from the outside and no possibility of by himself coming out or anything. And then in the next verse, he describes further on this covering on the nature of that covering as well. And so it's Avritam Yanametena Kyanino Nityavayarina Kamarupena Kantiya Dushpurina Nalenacha, where Krishna describes that the living entity, we know originally we are Satchit Ananda Vigraha, so we are full of knowledge and bliss. So that's why Krishna uses the word for the living entity, Yanina, that we are actually a wise by nature, full of knowledge. But this knowledge, Gyanam Avritam Etina, it gets covered by what? In the form of lust. Kama Rupena Kantiya Tushpurina Nalenacha. And this lust is Tushpurina, it's insatiable. You can never be satisfied. And Analenacha, it burns like fire. So, Prabhu yesterday was also discussing a bit on that, how lust, it can never be satisfied. Or actually, Ganesham Govinda Prabhu recently mentioned how Prabhupada in one purport explains, gives a nice definition of lust, material desires, of karma. So there he says that those desires which can never be satisfied are called lusty desires, material desires. And because even if you indulge and have successfully, apparently, you still, obviously, you just want more and more. It just, you don't get real satisfaction. For a moment you might feel good, but then it just never ends. And when you don't get satisfied, then you become angry. So and when you get satisfied, then you develop more and more greed. So in that way, lust always leads to either anger or greed, always to bad effects. And obviously there's many examples in Bhagavatam of how personalities who exhibited very dramatically. For example, in the 9th canto, King Pururava, when he got mad after Urvashi, the chief heavenly damsel. And so that's quite an amazing description there, if you go in. And yesterday I heard, and not too long ago also read about Agnidra, whom I mentioned before, that he's the eldest son of Maharaj Priyavrata. And we discussed Priyavrata Maharaj, obviously he's a pure devotee, so much so although he was the eldest son of, not Uttanapad, that's his brother, of Swayambhu Manu, who is the ruler of the whole Bhumandala, the whole planetary system that we are in, not just this planet, but we discussed like all the different dvipas and varshas, so it's huge. But Priyavrata Maharaj, he didn't even want to take up kingship, which was his rightful claim. Rather, he was fully absorbed in devotional service. He wanted to be an Ashtika brahmachari. But then, as the pastimes go, we know that in Uttanapad's line, eventually then it stopped after the Prachetas had Daksha as his second birth. Then he went off to perform austerities for a very long time, so then no one was here to rule. And so then Lord Brahma Swayambhu Manu convinced Priyavrata Maharaj to become king. And so, just keep in mind, he is a pure devotee, but somehow or other, I guess by the Lord's will, with begetting his first son, he was, it said, materially distracted. His consciousness was not fully absorbed in, yes, my Lord, I want to beget a very Krishna-conscious, nice son, a nice devotee. But rather, this first son, Agnidhar, had, even though pious, but he was Pitrulokakam, it's described specifically. He wanted to reach one of the heavenly planets, lower heavenly planets called Pitruloka. And for that, he, to be able to stay up there, it's said that you need a good son who is continuously offering sacrifices on your behalf. So then you're allowed to stay there even after this one life that you reach there. And so for that, and to fulfill his material desire, he went off to one place where it was known that the heavenly planets tend to come down there sometimes. And so he went there and performed austerities to please Lord Brahma, his no, he came much later. Oh yeah, his great-grandfather, something like that. Anyway, so Lord Brahma, he eventually came and blessed him. Or, so I can't remember, I think he didn't even come. No, rather Lord Brahma, understanding his desire, he sent his chief dancing girl, Purvachiti, I believe, what's her name? And so, yeah, the description there is how Agnidhar actually couldn't even recognize immediately that who she was. He was even thinking that she might be a Muniputra, a son of a great sage there, a young son. So, and Prabhupada describes there that, is what lust does to us, that we lose all discrimination. And discussed it last time, how Narad Muni, he, then later when eventually Daksha did reassume his role, having gotten the full blessings of the Lord, the full potency of being a Prajapati, then he begot 10,000 sons, the Haryashvas, but he sent them to perform austerities, and Narad Muni, seeing them as good candidates to rather going back than to engage in mature life, to rather stay as renunciates and perfect their spiritual lives. We preached to them and we discussed that a bit. One of those things was he taught them in an enigmatic way. He didn't say directly, but they had their great purified intelligence they could immediately understand and apply it to themselves and follow it. And so one of the things he said was describing that there is an unchaste prostitute changing her dresses all the time. And the Harivashas understood that refers to the polluted intelligence, the materially polluted intelligence of the living entity. And so, and further he described that there's a husband of this prostitute who is obviously the living entity himself. And and there Prabhupada described how if you follow such polluted intelligence, you lose all independence and you simply prolong your material life. And so Agnidhar faced that. He lost his intelligence, seeing having in the first place performed austerities with material desires and then fulfilled his desire. So then obviously he simply wanted to be with Purvachiti and get a son in her. And one point that I heard from my Guru Maharaj yesterday on talking on this topic was that we see from there that that Maya is not she covers our knowledge, our intelligence, and so we just as Agnidhar was not able to understand what's happening there and was simply helplessly following his material desires, that's what's happening to us if we go into Maya, if we pursue our material desires. Because even for devotees, generally many times we come to Krishna consciousness because somehow, at least to some good degree, we got materially exhausted. We found that there's no real happiness in that. I want to look for something else, and then we, by Krishna's mercy, we came into contact with devotees and came to Krishna consciousness here by Srila Prabhupada's mercy. And so that's for a start for most of us, but then that alone doesn't sustain our devotional service, because how Maya works is that she even though if you get materially exhausted, again after some time, Maya will cover even our experience, our knowledge of how we got frustrated, how it's not fulfilling. Even though we might have had that realization, it doesn't stay. Because, as Guru Maharaj many times would say, there's no education department in Maya. And it's the Lord's illusory potency. Her very service is to give us this opportunity of forgetting Krishna and enjoying separately from Him. And the best service, so to say, that she is doing, the favor that she is doing to us is to make us materially exhausted eventually. But that doesn't stay. That simply serves as an opportunity to then be able to actually listen to devotees. Because otherwise, if we're fully materially absorbed, we see that if you try to preach to some random person, generally, they don't understand, they don't even want to listen. It doesn't go into their head, into their heart. But if someone is materially exhausted, then okay, he's ready to hear. So that's the best that Maya can do. She will never give us real education, no matter how much experience we gather. That's why many times we quote this famous line of Shukadeva Goswami that Pashyan api na pashyati. Even though you have sinned, you have experienced how miserable it is to pursue your material desires, but na pashyati, still you're not able to see. Again, Maya presents, now you have some better experience, now you have some better knowledge, you can do it in a bit more sophisticated way, now you will be successful. Like even as devotees, for example, now Maya might say, now you know, you should follow the 4 regulative principles, and or at least few of them. You're actually much more civilized now, better intelligence, better facilities. So now you can do it in a nice way. Now you can be successful. But so that's Maya's service. So we can't blame her. We can only blame ourselves if we don't take full advantage of hearing this Srimad Bhagavatam and the message of Krishna, and applying ourselves fully to devotional service. And another nice point Guru Maharaj made is, so first to finish with, so Maya, she doesn't have an education department. Whereas if we come to Krishna consciousness, as we many times would hear from Prabhupada, it's, Krishna is just like the sun. So as soon as you go in front of Krishna and surrender to Him, then everything becomes illuminated. You can understand material nature, how you are situated in here, how you're entangled, and how you can become free, to engage in devotional service, and how to have real happiness and knowledge and bliss. And so that's the only way. As I said, Maya just being materially exhausted and then not fully giving your heart to devotional service, then again it will creep in. It's only by param drishta nivartate, by getting the higher taste, by deepening our attraction to Shri Shri Radha Gopinath. And then it becomes natural to overcome this illusion, these material desires. Like Prabhupada would explain, because for a long time, devotees, even as devotees, we don't become free completely of material desires. They're still there, and once in a while they'll come in the mind, even while chanting or whatever, old memories from our degraded life from previously. But what's happening is that by Krishna's mercy, at least very quickly we lose our tendency to pursue them. We can easily push it away. We understand our intelligence is purified. We understand, well, that's Maya, and I don't want that, so push it away and again focus on Shri Shri Radha Gopinath, cry out more eagerly, more sincerely to get their shelter. And so, but generally for living entities, why we are not ready to listen is, as I said, when we are not maturely exhausted, and in that way it's we are determined to stay in darkness. We don't want to get into light, to go in front of Shri Shri Radha Gopinath. And Guru Maharaj gave, because here in the purport and in the later part, Prabhupada is explaining about, because Lord Brahma, in the verse we hear, that he gave up that body being ashamed, and that body appeared in all directions as a dangerous fog in darkness. So he gave up that ignorant body with material desire, and Prabhupada then in the second half, the Prabhupada explains on this fog. The feature of ignorance is darkness or fog, which covers the whole universe. And why fog? Because fog, the nature is that, at least those of us who would have had experience driving at night, if there's a strong fog, then no matter how strong the light is that you turn on, it doesn't help. Like, I don't know what's it called, like the ones go far and then there's the light which goes not so far, which goes more wide. So it doesn't help to turn on the far lights which go far. Rather, you get kind of even more blinded because of the reflection of those tiniest water particles, the fog. So, which shows that by our personal endeavor we are not able to overcome ignorance. Just as fog can only be dissipated if the sun rises or if the sun comes out, in the same way we can only become free from ignorance if Krishna bestows his mercy upon him, if he reveals himself to us. So the example that Guru Maharaj gave there with our determination of wanting to stay in darkness, of thinking we don't need anyone, we don't need Krishna, is he explained, it's just as sometimes we might, at night time in our home, when we have to get up and use bathroom, we might not even turn on the light because we are confident, okay, I know how to maneuver or where it is to get to the bathroom. And we might be kind of proud of it, yeah, I don't need light, I know how to do, I know how to go. But obviously in our home, okay, we might actually know properly where it is exactly. But let's say if it's somewhere else, which we don't know at all, and we try to do that, then we might bump into many things and fall over, whatever. But if you're still determined that, no, I don't need light, I know where to go, I know my destination, I know how to get there, I know how to be happy. That's what we're doing when we're in material life. We are determined, no, I know how, like the word was, Guru Maharaj was saying, we are proud while groping in darkness. So imagine you're in a dark room, dark house, and you're walking around and reluctant to turn on the light switch. And how easy it is, as soon as you turn on the switch, everything is illuminated and so easily you can maneuver and reach your destination. But the conditioned souls are reluctant to do that. So that Guru Maharaj was telling this in a class of talking on Mother Devahuti addressing her son Lord Kapila, whom she addressed as Yoga Bhaskara, as the son of yoga, in other words, only the Lord can really explain to us what is real yoga or how to really reconnect with the Lord, what is pure devotional service. And that was the reciprocation actually of her husband, who was pure devotee, Kadama Muni, who had left her by that time. When he was about to leave, she had told him that, "Oh my dear husband, my dear Lord, all my life I was attached to you for all the wrong reasons. I thought, yeah, you're a nice husband, just on a material platform, but I didn't realize that you're a self-realized soul, and therefore you're capable of bestowing upon me also transcendental knowledge, and thus releasing me from this material bondage. But now you're going, because as soon as Kadama Muni, Lord, I can't remember, was it first the 9 daughters who were born? And then Lord Kapila. Kapila Dev afterwards, right? Yeah, that was after, because when Kadama Muni would have left, then she appealed to him to please, what you haven't given me is, like, you gave me all this material enjoyment, but you haven't given me fearlessness. And so then he begets Lord Kapiladev, who then instructs Mother Devahuti and thus delivers her as well. And yeah, also like, and what happened before that again ties nicely to the current topic, is that we said that, for example, Daksha, which we discussed last time, he also worshipped the Lord in a very austere way, performing great austerities, offering the Hamsaguya prayers, and the Lord personally appeared to him. But he did it with intense material desire of wanting to procreate, like so much, like thousands of sons, as we just said he had. Whereas Kardama Muni, great devotee, but he did have a tinge of material desire initially, and Lord Brahma had also instructed him to beget children, to be a Prajapati. But so yeah, the pastime then goes that the Lord appears to him as well, blesses him, and then then Kardama Muni, after that, then the Lord, so to say, sent Svayambhuva Manu out, that he is at that time then searching for a proper husband for one of his 3 daughters, Mother Devahuti. And so then they come to Kardama Muni's ashram and request him to please accept her as his wife. And even that itself is quite amazing, that like she was a great princess of a great king of the rule of the whole Bhumandala. And then, but see the vision of those great personalities, that her father, first of all, her parents, Mother Shatarupa and Swayambhuva Manu, and then Mother Devahuti herself, they all understood real greatness. Even though she was used to great material opulence, they went out of their way to go to a renounced sage living there in the forest to beg him to please accept my daughter, and who then didn't give her any nice material facilities described. But she was serving him so faithfully that she got her body got very thin and kind of dirty, I'm not sure, but like emaciated, yeah. So she practically neglected herself, her own body, and just engaged in serving her great husband, who was always simply absorbed in meditating on the Lord. And then eventually, then she did request him, or I think it meant that when he noted at one point that actually, oh, my wife, she's so emaciated, like what's happening? Then he asked her, or told her, I'm so pleased by your service, you completely selflessly served me, so what can I do? And then she expresses the desire to have children, and then he sends her into a lake, and she comes out. In that lake by his mystic power, he manifests many maidservants who serve her, who massage her and everything, and then her body becomes fully revived to her original beauty, and she comes out of the lake like that. And then, not only that, we know then so that's then his real grihastha period, you can say. But he didn't have to, oh, now I have to go out, get a job and earn some money to be able to give something. No, simply using his mystic power, he first of all gave her a fully beautiful body again, and then he created a huge, beautiful airplane, which was a whole city, with all the greatest material facilities on which then they traveled around all the most beautiful spots in the universe. So that's how they had their grihastha life, and how they then begot the children. And but we can see in the pastime that he was not at all attached to it. He fulfilled it, did his duty, and then, as I said, then immediately understood, okay, now my duty is done, begot children. He went off to the forest, and then that's when, which just said, Mother Devahuti appealed to him for his mercy, also for not only on the material platform, but also on the spiritual platform. And yeah, so that's how then she got enlightenment by Lord Kapila. Just quickly check if there was anything else in the purport. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Actually, okay. I want to mention also. So this idea of that we know simply material exhaustion alone doesn't sustain our staying away from Maya, but we have to develop the higher taste, and like Prabhupada many times would say, you can't become free of desires, but rather we have to spiritualize our desires, have to cultivate spiritual desires. And there's a very famous, beautiful verse and purport in the 4th canto, chapter 22, of when the 4 Kumaras appear to the assembly of Prithu Maharaj and instruct him in transcendental knowledge. Although, obviously, he's a Shaktivesh avatar, he's fully enlightened already, but as an example, again, for us, he very humbly presents himself, he washes their feet and everything, and presents himself as a fallen soul, depending on their instructions. And so one of those famous verses that they are telling is, just take part of it, paraphrasing, so that's text 39, where they say that the devotees are always engaged in the service of the toes of the lotus feet of the Lord, and thus can very easily overcome the hard-knotted desires for fruitive activities. On the other hand, jnanis and yogis, although trying to stop the waves of sense gratification, cannot do so. And yeah, so as we described, the nature of material desire, of lust, is such that it's dushpurnina nalinacha. It just doesn't stop. It's like waves, like in the ocean, one wave comes after the other, you can't stop it. It's just like that all the time. And similarly, jnanis and yogis, they try on that side of to become free of material, simply becoming free of material desires, but not knowing what real desires are, to wanting to please Shri Radha Gopinath. And in that way, temporarily, they may become little detached, but then they are not able to become really free. Actually, that is beautifully explained also in what I mentioned before, when Narad Muni is instructing the Haryashvas. One of the things he's telling them is that there is a river flowing in both directions. And the Haryashvas understand that that refers to material nature working in two ways, which is creation and dissolution. And further it's described there that in that river, near the banks, the currents are even swifter. So you might, through knowledge and renunciation, you might be able to get towards the bank, swim away from the waves, from the middle of the river, but then by that alone, it's very hard to get out actually, because it becomes the current even stronger there. And I'll continue here and then come back to Prithu Maharaj, hearing from the Kumaras. So, and Prabhupada is explaining here that one must understand how Maya works and how one can be released from the tossing waves of the river of nescience. That is one's first duty. So that's the first duty, and then comes devotional service. And but to be able to do that sincerely, we need to understand also the nature of Maya. But again, that's explained nicely here that we cannot do that by experience in Maya. We can do that only by the mercy of devotees. That's also further then substantiated in the next verse, two after that actually. When one other point that Narad Muni is mentioning is that there is a speaking swan, and the Haryashvas understand that refers to the Shastras, to Vedic knowledge, by which one is enabled to understand the Lord and his energies and material nature. But why swan is used, Hamsa is on the material analogy is that swans are able to separate milk from water. So in other words, they're able to discriminate, to discern what's truth and what's untruth. And so similarly, Hamsa also is, refers to the spiritual developed person. He's able to discriminate matter and spirit and accept only the essence, which is devotional service. And further, so it's this Vedic knowledge, it explains the means of bondage and of liberation. And there, Prabhupada in the purport explains that in the West especially, we see how students are becoming hippies, despite gorgeous arrangements for university education. And therefore, the Krishna consciousness movement is trying to convert those misguided, drug-addicted students to the service of Krishna. So that, again, coming back to this, shows this point of how Maya itself doesn't give us education, even the greatest university education that you may provide. What does it lead to? As Prabhupada many times would point it out, it makes the youth into hippies, that it was at that time, or drug addicts and all kinds of degraded people, as you see nowadays still as well. But yeah, as I discussed before, only by the mercy of devotees we can actually get education. So now coming back to Prithu Maharaj, they're instructing the Kumars instructing Prithu Maharaj, where it was described about the waves of material desires not being able to, that yogis, even great yogis and jnanis, they can't fully overcome it. Whereas, on the other hand, devotees, the Kumaras are saying, they are always engaged in the service of the toes of the lotus feet, and thus very easily overcome the hard-knotted desires for fruitive activities. And it's an amazing purport there. It'd be nice to read sometime, but a few points I took out here, with which I want to conclude. So Prabhupada is describing there that desire becomes a source of spiritual enjoyment under the protection of the toes of the lotus feet of the Lord. Because the Kumaras, they said that the devotees engaged in the service of the toes of the lotus feet of the Lord. Still we say lotus feet of the Lord, but they take it even further to make it clear, yes, the humility that a devotee feels, his full realization that I am so tiny, such a tiny part and parcel of Krishna, and so all I can do is begging for an opportunity to serve him. Obviously we know then in the higher rasas that the mood becomes bit different in terms of that the expression comes then that you don't want to think of Krishna as God, but rather in a more intimate way. But to come to that, first we need to realize that we are the servant of Krishna in such a way, as the Kumaras are describing here. So, and in that way, desire becomes a source of spiritual enjoyment under the protection of the toes of the lotus feet of the Lord. And then Prabhupada is giving a beautiful analogy of now coming to, as in the verse it describes about those waves of material desires hitting us one after the other. So Prabhupada is describing there that it may be argued that the waves of a river are incessantly flowing and cannot be stopped. But then he takes that analogy to a bit a different angle of how we might not consider it at first. He explains that, but the waves of the river flow towards the sea. And in that section, the river being close to the sea, then Prabhupada is explaining that when the tide comes over the river, it overwhelms the flowing of the river, and the river itself becomes overflooded, and the waves of the sea become more prominent than the waves of the river. In other words, if there's really full-on tide, then rather than the river flowing this direction into the sea, the waves coming like this, it can go the other way around, even that the water from the ocean flows into the river. And obviously Prabhupada gives that analogy for when the material desires become converted to spiritual desires, then it goes completely opposite. Then we become free from bondage and full of bliss. Then, as he says, then such desires become a source of spiritual enjoyment. And so Prabhupada further says here then, similarly, so now in a more practical way of how to apply that, Prabhupada is explaining that a devotee with intelligence plans so many things for the service of the Lord in Krishna consciousness that the stagnant material desires become overflooded by the desire to serve the Lord. So he keeps on the same analogy of flooding of the waves, but those stagnant material desires, so they have, because spiritual desires on the other hand, they are dynamic. There's all, like we said, lust is dushpurinana lenacha, it's insatiable, but spiritual desires in a higher level, they are also insatiable. But which doesn't mean that you don't get satisfaction. No, you do get the deepest satisfaction, but still you want more, but in a spiritually ecstatic way, that you still know that you can never serve enough. never render enough devotional service to Shri Shri Radha Gopinath. So in that way, it overfloods those stagnant material desires. If we always apply our otherwise polluted intelligence in simply trying how we can serve more, how we can give more pleasure to the Lord. Obviously, I mean, what pleasure can we give? It's only by taking shelter of our spiritual masters of senior devotees of Srila Prabhupada that we somehow or other trying to assist them in Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's mission, then we can be used as an instrument and can, despite our disqualifications, can become also a source of pleasure to Sri Sri Radha Gopinath. Okay, so I'll end here. Any questions or comments? Yes. Okay, thank you. Grantarachima Bhaktam Ke Cha, Srila Prabhupada Ke Cha.